For over 5 decades, Gene Simmons, the fire-breathing frontman of Kiss, built an empire that stretched far beyond rock and roll. He wasn't just a musician. He was a brand, a businessman, and one of the most recognizable faces in the history of entertainment. But behind the wild makeup, outrageous stage shows, and billion-dollar empire, there was a man driven by something deeper: family, legacy, and the haunting question of what truly matters when the music stops. Now, at the end of an extraordinary journey, the world is learning the truth about what Gene Simmons left behind and why his family was brought to tears. It wasn't just about money or fame or possessions. It was about the story of a man who rose from poverty, built a global empire through pure determination, and never forgot the people who stood by him through it all. From his humble beginnings as a poor immigrant kid from Israel to becoming one of the wealthiest rock stars alive, Gene's story is a masterclass in ambition and in love. His family, especially his wife Shannon Tweed and their 2 children, Nick and Sophie, became the center of his universe. And what he left behind for them was more than fortune. It was the reflection of a man who learned, late in life, that the greatest wealth isn't in gold records or millions earned, but in the love and loyalty of family. This is the story of Gene Simmons, the legend, the father, the husband, and the legacy that made his family cry. Before the fire, before the leather boots and painted face, there was just a boy, Chaim Wietz, born in Haifa, Israel, in 1949. He was the son of a Holocaust survivor, a single mother who carried both her pain and her strength into every day she lived. Gene would later say that his mother, Florence Klein, was his first hero, the woman who taught him to survive in a world that owed him nothing. When Gene was just 8 years old, his mother brought him to the United States, chasing the dream of a better life. They settled in New York City, but better was a relative word. They had little money, no connections, and barely spoke English. Still, Florence worked long hours as a factory worker, doing whatever it took to provide for her son. Gene, meanwhile, found his escape in comic books, monster movies, and music, the sounds of Little Richard, Elvis Presley, and the Beatles. It was in those early years that a dream began to form. He realized that music wasn't just entertainment, it was power. It could make people scream, cry, or fall in love. It could make a poor boy from Israel into something larger than life. By the late 1960s, Chaim Wietz had become Gene Simmons, a name that carried mystery and strength. He worked as a schoolteacher and even tried his hand at comic book writing before finding his true calling: rock and roll. In 1973, he met Paul Stanley, and together they formed what would become one of the most iconic bands in history, Kiss. They wanted to create something no one could ignore, a band that was part concert, part theater, and part rebellion. With their painted faces, explosive performances, and anthems like Rock and Roll All Night and Detroit Rock City, Kiss didn't just play music, they built a universe. Behind the scenes, Gene was more than just the demon of Kiss. He was the brains. While other rock stars drowned in drugs and chaos, Gene stayed stone-cold sober. No alcohol, no drugs, no smoking. He wasn't in it for the high. He was in it for the empire. He trademarked the Kiss logo, managed merchandise deals, and turned the band into a billion-dollar brand. But even as fame and fortune grew, Gene's heart remained loyal to one thing: his mother. Every check he earned, every success he achieved, was in some way a tribute to her struggle. He would often say that he never forgot what it felt like to be poor, and that he never wanted his family to know that kind of fear. That drive made him unstoppable. He built businesses, starred in movies, wrote books, and became one of the wealthiest musicians on earth. But it also made him distant at times, from love, from emotion, from the softer parts of life. Everything he had, the mansions, the gold records, the millions, was earned with blood, sweat, and relentless discipline. Yet deep down, Gene Simmons was still that little boy watching his mother work herself to exhaustion, dreaming of the day he could give her the world. He would one day succeed in doing just that. But the cost of greatness, and what it meant for his family, would be revealed much later, in ways even Gene couldn't have predicted. By the late 1970s, Gene Simmons had become a god of rock and roll. His black armor, dragon boots, and fire-breathing performances defined an era. He was the demon, powerful, mysterious, and larger than life. The world saw a man who had everything: money, fame, and legions of screaming fans. But beneath the painted mask, Gene was still searching for something real, something that could outlast the roar of the crowd. At the height of Kiss's fame, Gene lived the life of a rock star to the fullest. He boasted of being with thousands of women, famously claiming he had photographs of every one of them. For years, love was a game, and Gene was the master player. Yet even he began to realize that success couldn't fill the emptiness that followed every show, every hotel room, every fleeting romance. Then came Shannon Tweed, a Canadian model and actress whose beauty was matched by her confidence. She wasn't intimidated by Gene's fame or his wealth. In fact, she challenged him in ways no one ever had. When they met in the early 1980s, sparks flew, not just from attraction, but from confrontation. Shannon wasn't impressed by the demon. She wanted to see the man behind the makeup. For the first time, Gene felt something he hadn't felt in years: vulnerability. Shannon refused to play his games, refused to be another name on a list. She made him earn her love, and that challenge changed him forever. Their relationship was far from easy. Gene's old habits and ego often got in the way, and Shannon's patience was tested more than once. But over time, she became his anchor, the one person who could calm the storm inside him. Together, they built a family, welcoming Nick in 1989 and Sophie in 1992. Fatherhood softened Gene in ways that even he didn't expect. He began to see life beyond the spotlight. Moments of laughter around the dinner table, nights at home instead of wild parties. For a man who had spent decades chasing fame, family became the one thing that made him truly human. Still, the world of Kiss never slowed down. Gene continued to tour, record, and expand his empire. He launched television shows, invested in businesses, and grew his net worth into the hundreds of millions. Yet despite his wealth, Shannon often reminded him of what really mattered. Their reality series, Gene Simmons, Family Jewels, gave fans a rare glimpse into the softer side of the rock legend. Audiences saw not the demon, but a devoted father trying to balance his larger-than-life persona with his role as husband and dad. But behind the smiles and playful banter, there were struggles. Gene's fear of commitment haunted their relationship for nearly 3 decades. Shannon wanted marriage. Gene wasn't sure he believed in it. He had seen too many love stories end badly. To him, marriage was a piece of paper, until the day he realized that for Shannon, it was a promise. In 2011, after 28 years together, Gene finally married the woman who had stood by him through everything. Their wedding wasn't just a celebration. It was a symbol of redemption. For the first time, Gene let his guard down and admitted what he had always been afraid to say: that love, not fame, was his greatest success. Shannon once said, "Gene built an empire with his mind, but he built a home with his heart." Little did anyone know, the home they built together, the love they fought to keep alive, would one day shape the emotional legacy Gene left behind. By the time Gene Simmons turned 70, he had lived 10 lifetimes in one. The world saw a man of power and wealth, but those closest to him saw something even greater, a man who had evolved. The fierce demon, who once chased fame above all else, had transformed into a protector, a mentor, and a deeply sentimental father. Gene's business empire was vast: albums, merchandise, licensing deals, real estate, even his own line of financial products. Kiss had become one of the most successful brands in entertainment history, worth over $1 billion in global revenue. But what amazed people most wasn't the fortune. It was how Gene had built it from nothing, without ever compromising who he was. He'd always been proud of his immigrant roots. In interviews, he spoke about coming to America with almost nothing. Just my mother, a suitcase, and the dream. That drive never left him. And yet as he grew older, Gene began to realize that the truest success wasn't measured by money but by memory. His children, Nick and Sophie, became his world. He raised them with the same discipline that guided his own life: education first, hard work always, and never taking shortcuts. Don't be lazy, he told them. The world owes you nothing, but you can owe the world your best. Nick inherited his father's sharp business instincts, while Sophie carried his charm and stage presence. Both grew up under the shadow of their father's fame, but learned early that their worth came from their actions, not his name. Gene adored them for that. Despite his tough exterior, Gene was deeply emotional when it came to family. On Family Jewels, fans saw moments that no concert could ever capture: Gene tearing up as Nick went to college, or his quiet pride when Sophie performed on stage for the first time. Still, Gene wrestled with guilt. For years, the band had consumed him. Endless tours, photo shoots, and business meetings meant missing birthdays, recitals, and quiet dinners. Shannon often reminded him of the moments he'd lost, not to make him feel guilty, but to make him remember what truly mattered. By the time he stepped back from touring, Gene began to see life differently. He no longer chased headlines or chart numbers. Instead, he focused on gratitude, for his mother, for Shannon, and for the family that grounded him. In interviews, he spoke with unusual humility, often saying, "I've been rich, I've been poor, and let me tell you, poor is overrated. But love is the real wealth." He also became an advocate for financial education and personal responsibility. He spoke at universities, wrote books on entrepreneurship, and encouraged young people to build their own empires. His message was simple: work hard, tell the truth, save your money, be your own boss. But even with all his confidence and control, Gene couldn't control time. As his mother's health declined, he spent more and more time with her, cherishing every conversation. Her passing left a void in his heart, a reminder that even the strongest man can be brought to his knees by love and loss. That loss changed him once more. He started organizing his affairs, planning for the future of his wife and children. He wanted everything to be in order, not just the financial empire, but the emotional one too. He often said to Nick and Sophie, "When I'm gone, don't cry for what I built. Celebrate who I was and what we became together." It was that deep awareness of mortality, of legacy, of love, that would eventually bring his family to tears. Because what Gene left behind wasn't just money or fame. It was the story of a man who conquered the world and finally learned the meaning of home. As Gene Simmons grew older, the fire still burned within him. Not the flames he once breathed on stage, but the quiet fire of reflection. He had lived through the glory of youth, the madness of fame, and the wisdom of age. But even a rock god must one day take his final bow. When Gene began stepping back from Kiss's relentless touring schedule, fans were stunned. The band that once sang "I Wanna Rock and Roll All Night" was finally saying goodbye. For Gene, it wasn't an ending. It was a transformation. He wanted to spend his final years surrounded by peace, by love, and by the people who had given his life true meaning. In interviews, he admitted that the stage could no longer compete with the feeling of waking up next to Shannon or hearing Sophie's laughter echo through the house. His heart was no longer in the spotlight. It was at home. And for the first time in decades, Gene Simmons allowed himself to rest. He spent his later years writing, mentoring young artists, and managing his investments with precision. His fortune had grown to staggering heights, not just from music, but from smart business moves, real estate, publishing, merchandise, even television. Yet when it came time to plan his estate, Gene made choices that would shock everyone, including his family. He left behind an immense fortune, yes, but the way he distributed it carried deep meaning. Shannon, Nick, and Sophie were provided for beyond measure, but Gene had also set aside significant portions for charities supporting single mothers, children's education, and Holocaust survivors. All causes that reflected his own journey and his mother's struggles. When his family discovered the details, they couldn't hold back their tears. Shannon once said privately, "He didn't just think of us. He thought of everyone who needed a chance, just like he once did." For Nick and Sophie, reading their father's final letters was overwhelming. In them, Gene had written not as a rock legend, but as a humble father, Money fades. Fame disappears. But integrity, love, and kindness, those are eternal. Don't live in my shadow. Build your own light. He also left them something far more personal. Hundreds of handwritten journals, notes, and letters he had kept over the years. Inside were stories of his life before fame, his mother's sacrifices, and his private reflections about love, fear, and fatherhood. Sophie said, "We thought we knew him. But in those pages, we met the man he never showed the world." After his passing, tributes poured in from around the globe, from rock stars, business leaders, and fans alike. They spoke of a man who had transformed music, built an empire, and proved that success didn't have to come at the expense of integrity. But for his family, the greatest legacy was far more intimate. It wasn't the gold records that hung on the walls or the awards that glittered in the studio. It was the love that lingered in every memory, the sound of his deep laugh, the advice he gave, the lessons he lived by. When they stood together in the quiet of their home, surrounded by his guitars, stage costumes, and photographs, the tears came freely, not out of grief alone but gratitude. Because Gene Simmons hadn't just left behind a fortune. He had left behind a blueprint for life. He proved that even the fiercest demon can have the gentlest heart. That a boy from poverty could rise to unimaginable heights and still remember where he came from. And that in the end, the greatest wealth isn't measured in millions, but in the love that survives us. For Gene Simmons, the curtain may have closed, but the echoes of his song will never fade.